One of the first things we learn in Star Wars Episode 4 is that the Old Republic stood for 1,000 generations, and later media and source books took that pretty literally, setting the founding of the Republic about 25,000 years before the rise and fall of the Galactic Empire. So today we're going to go over what the Republic looked like at its conception, specifically by taking a look at its founding members, known as the Core Founders, conveniently located as they were in the Galactic Core. As we covered in a recent video, before the formation of the Republic, these planets, like most of the populated galaxy, were enslaved under the tyrannical rule of the Rakatan Infinite Empire. When a plague stripped away the Rakatans' abilities to use their force-powered technology, all of their subjugated territory rose up in revolt, freeing themselves and leaving the Galactic Core as a series of relatively disconnected planets or smaller states. Many of these core worlds, who would go on to form the Republic, were human-dominated, having been populated by sleeper ships sent out over the centuries by Coruscant, sometimes during Rakatan rule, but usually a little bit after. Hyperspace technology was fairly slow, so that limited contact between worlds, and that's why these sleeper ships were used. These would sometimes take generations to reach another planet. They would then establish a colony, and it would often mean there was limited communication or even no communication between some of those worlds. But eventually, Corellian and Duros scientists were able to reverse engineer Rakatan technology, building the first proper hyperdrives and allowing these distant worlds to unify. And according to the Old Republic Encyclopedia, they organized with the abolition of slavery as a driving tenet given their experience under the Rakatan Infinite Empire. To this end, the Galactic Constitution included a section called the Rights of Sentience, which, quote, outlawed slavery and declared that all conscious, sentient life forms share equal freedoms and rights in the Republic, end quote. The name of this, of course, is very similar to real-world works like The Rights of Man by Thomas Paine and some other Enlightenment works. According to at least one Corellian at the time, he would rather die than subject another to the cruelties of slavery that had tortured his ancestors and nearly wiped out his bloodline. While canon gives 22 as a hard number of planets considered core founders, in Legends we don't have a fixed number, although the known planets bring it to just under 20. The Essential Atlas lists most of them in different categories based on what they brought to the Republic. We'll go into each one individually in a minute, but these are the so-called political players like Coruscant itself, Corellia, Duros, Alsakan, Kuat, and Alderaan, then heavily militarized worlds like Axum, Metellos, Anaxes, and Rhinnal. Then you have commerce centers like Brentaal, Tepasi, and Rhinnal, and finally worlds important to the medical, diplomatic, and philosophical arts like Chandrila, Caamas, Rhinnal, and most surprisingly of all, Shawken. Coruscant, as one possible birthplace for humanity as a species, had already exploded in population, and while it didn't quite look like the pure cityscape we see on the Ecumenopolis in more modern times, at least some areas of multi-layered cityscape existed for tens of millennia already. Iconic landmarks like the Senate Tower were present from these earliest days. One of the things which secured Coruscant's position at the epicenter of galactic life was its position directly on two of the most important hyperspace routes in the galaxy at the time, the Perlemian trade route, which went out to planets like Alsakan and Brentaal to the northeast, and then to the southeast you had the Corellian run, which went out to some other planets like Corellia and Duros. Most planets which would join the Republic at this early stage existed either on those two lanes or within the small wedge between them. This positioning only served to heighten the rivalry between Coruscant and at least one other particular core founder, Alsakan, which was located just a bit farther along the Perlemian trade route, and which was actually a relatively young world, having only been colonized by Coruscant sleeper ships about 1,000 years prior to the Republic's founding. Alsakan, over the entire history of the Republic, would become a flashpoint leading to well over a dozen revolts against the Republic, often spurred by tensions between human interests represented by Alsakan and the more cosmopolitan nature of Coruscant, which brought together a much wider variety of alien species. This became more and more true as the Republic expanded throughout the galaxy, discovering more species along the way. There were some cases though, like the 6th and 7th Alsakan conflicts, where Alsakan became the champion of aliens against a human-dominated Republic based on Coruscant. Like many of the core founders, Alsakan was also home to one of the many wonders of the galaxy, called the Alsakan Mosaics. The city of Rukapar on Alsakan was situated between 5 mountains, with a path of tiles going from the center of each out to the 5 mountain peaks. It's unclear when exactly this was built, but it remained a tourist destination on the planet for millennia. Because of the limits on space travel which still existed, it's not uncommon for multiple core founders to be present in the same sector. But the next two core founders were actually within the same system even, Axum and Anaxes. Like Alsakan, Axum and Anaxes were colonies of earlier human sleeper ships, though their history goes back significantly further. The Essential Atlas mentions both as being the center of the Azure Imperium for tens of millennia before the Republic. Anaxes, which would later get the moniker the Defender of the Core under the Republic, enacted as a staging ground for the Republic's final offensive, the Outer Rim sieges in the Clone Wars, got its start as the Imperium's major shipyard. Axum, despite probably being the less famous of the two now, was actually the larger political, commercial, and population center, outstripping the production capacity of Anaxes by many times. On Anaxes, culture is dominated by their naval traditions, with Anaxes being the home to the Republic's Naval College. Many important military families like the Ozels and the Bangiers were originally from Anaxes. Axum's residents, on the other hand, were reputed as, quote, excruciatingly mannered, rigid, formal people who will happily lecture an unwary visitor about the legacy of the Azure Imperium. And to them, even the oldest precincts of Coruscant have a faintly disagreeable tinge of new credits and ill-breeding, end quote. Like Alsakan, Axum was also the home to one of the ancient wonders of the galaxy, an army of soldiers made of brass, kind of like a more expensive terracotta army, but where all the soldiers were fixed in horrifically painful-looking positions, with some theorizing that the soldiers were not statues, but in fact formerly living beings who were alchemically frozen in that position, making them tragically unable to click the like button and subscribe for more. They can't even click away if they think this is boring. Going a bit further out, we have the pair of planets most responsible for the hyperspace tech which brought these core founders together, Corellia and Duros, unless you count Lehon as actually making the tech, but we won't. Corellia's independent streak goes back to the Republic's founding, where it was given unique powers called Contemplantis Hermi in the Constitution, which allowed the world to set aside its obligations to the Republic while maintaining membership in times of trouble. The Corellia system included several other worlds beyond just Corellia itself, including Salonia and Draal, the homeworlds of two species of the same names, although neither of those planets gets the same credit as core founders, something which raised another question we'll get to later about which planets actually do or don't count as core founders. It's believed that the system itself was artificially created by the Celestials, using Centerpoint Station, a massive installation in the Corellian system, to pull together the system's worlds around the sun, Coral. While Corellia may always have had some alien presence thanks to the Salonians and Draal, Duros, in the same sector as Corellia, was one of the few core founders entirely dominated by a non-human species, the Duros. The Duros, like the Corellians and Coruscanti, had always been dedicated explorers, using hyperspace cannons to explore nearby space before there was any safe way to guarantee a return trip with their reverse-engineered Rakatan hyperdrives. So these were basically giant ship cannons that would shoot you out through hyperspace somewhere, and then you were kind of just stuck there. Around the time of the Republic's formation, much like Coruscant, the Duros had already begun colonizing other worlds, including Cato Neimoidia, where the new inhabitants became known as a related species but no longer counted as Duros, the Neimoidians. As Duros itself developed, rather than following Coruscant's model and building layers of cities, the Duros moved to orbital cities and then slowly just polluted the homeworld to the point of uninhabitability, further aggravated by bombardment in the Clone Wars and then the Yuuzhan Vong War. This actually ended alright for them because in the Yuuzhan Vong War, the Yuuzhan Vong terraformed the planet, which started a process of healing the long-abused planetary surface. This was something the Duros definitely needed, since during the war, their orbital city ships were also mostly destroyed. While aliens were certainly outnumbered by humans in the early Republic, the Duros weren't the only non-human core founders. Another world, Caamas, home to the Caamasi, became an important member thanks to their role in developing moral philosophy, including teachings which would influence the Jedi. Caamas and the Caamasi were pacifists, and never developed to the same level as many of the other core founders, so the population of Caamasi was always fairly low. Caamas, much like Alderaan, remained a relatively lush planet until both were actually destroyed by the Empire. Because of the similar political philosophies of the planets, many Caamasi took refuge on Alderaan after Caamas was destroyed, meaning much of the surviving Caamasi diaspora died alongside the Alderaanians. Alderaan itself was also one of these core founders, thought to be a, quote, symbol of human culture at its best, with cities built to coexist with nature, end quote, but also contributing to a very high kill ratio in the Clone Wars and the Empire when it comes to the core founders. I think somewhere around a quarter of them get entirely devastated within the space of a couple decades. The human population on Alderaan, well established long before the Republic's founding, were not actually the planet's original inhabitants. Throughout the world, signs persisted of a prior population of Killiks, an insectoid species with a hive mind who lived in mounds found throughout Alderaan and many other worlds in the galaxy. As servants of the Rakatan's predecessors, they didn't tend to survive the Rakatan Infinite Empire in the known galaxy, although large population centers did still exist in the unknown regions, and there actually were still some Killiks present on Alderaan alongside the human population. Primarily, the Killiks remained on Alderaan as a way for locals to farm experience in the Old Republic MMO. As if we needed any more examples of human depravity in Star Wars. Our next planet, Brentaal, like Alsakan and many of the other core planets along the Perlemian, was largely settled in the millennia between the Rakatan fall and the Republic's founding. But despite its largely uninhabitable ice caps and canyon-filled terrain, it ballooned over the Republic's history to over 65 billion inhabitants. While Coruscant sits at the intersection of the two major hyperlanes of the day, Brentaal would eventually gain a similarly important position when a new hyperlane, the Hydean Way, was created by Freya Kalia of Brentaal 20,000 years later, intersecting the Perlemian at Brentaal and taking away some of the limelight from Coruscant, though by this point Coruscant was already much more highly populated and important for other political reasons, so while it definitely added to Brentaal's usefulness and economic position, it didn't necessarily take much away from Coruscant. Coruscant had way too much limelight for that. While Chandrila is counted among the core founders in the Essential Atlas, other information on the planet from a sourcebook called Coruscant and the Core Worlds says it was actually settled in the early days of the Republic, which I think can be reconciled as being part of the same span of colonization as Brentaal, Alsakan, and so on. In many ways, it's similar to Alderaan, keeping an emphasis on nature, but capping its population around 1.2 billion for almost all of the Republic's history. The planet was highly affluent, resulting in jealousy from other planets in the Republic, but its reputation for political candor, probably chosen because it's Mon Mothma's homeworld and planets in Star Wars can only do one thing, did also heavily influence the political sphere of the Republic. Ecologically, a lot was shared between Alderaan, Chandrila, and Caamas, so it's interesting that two of the founders of the rebellion, Bail Organa and Mon Mothma, were actually the senators from two of those planets. For the Republic's early military, while we mentioned Anaxes as one of the major shipyards earlier on, a few other planets joined which contributed their shipbuilding capabilities to the Republic. While Kuat was present at this point, and it would later become one of the most prolific shipyards in the galaxy, especially under the Empire, and achieving that status was actually a long-time goal of the planet's leadership, throughout most of the Republic period, another planet outshone it heavily, named Rendili. Kuat was one of the older Coruscanti colonies, but its production seems to have been focused on its own sleeper ships, which colonized some of the other major planets we've already spoken about, like Axum, and two we're about to get to, Tepasi and Rhinnal. It's unclear when exactly this started, but through most of its history, Kuat was ruled by a consortium of 10 of the richest families, and society fell into a 4-tiered caste system, with the aristocracy tied to the families on top, and then off-world labor fell on the bottom. Despite Rendili's much higher importance in this period, information on it is a lot more sparse before the Clone Wars. Its ship designs like the Hammerhead Cruiser and Invincible can be seen throughout older Republic conflicts though. Aceles is another name like Axum, which may be less recognizable now, but which controlled a large empire of its own, including as many as 19 colonies in the Darpa sector, with Rhinnal, another core founder, among them. The examples of Aceles' empire and the Azur Imperium raise some questions about whether core founder means any member of the Republic at its inception, or if it's reserved essentially just for colonial powers and regional hegemons. So were all 19 Acelian worlds considered core founders, or did most of them join without the same status, essentially? Rhinnal was one of those worlds, becoming a center of medicine and healing under Acelian governance, but is definitely considered one of the core founders. What we don't know is whether this applies because it's a universal title for any original member planet, or if Rhinnal just gained enough significance to warrant the title despite being a subject world of another planet. We see the same thing with Rhinnal and Tepasi, colony worlds of Kuat mentioned a bit earlier. But unlike Acelles and Axum, Kuat doesn't seem to have been at the head of an earlier empire, so Tepasi and Humbereen, while maintaining some ties to Kuat, were probably more independent than, say, Rhinnal was. Humbereen became the hub of a group of highly industrialized manufacturing worlds in the core, called the Humbereen Rule. Unfortunately for Humbereen, it was also devastated during the Clone Wars in the same campaign, Operation Dirge's Lance, which ruined what remained of Duros' surface, although Humbereen was, if anything, even more damaged, turning yet another of these ancient, massive population centers into a ruined rock. With Tepasi, very little actual history is known, beyond that it was an early financial center with a strong aristocratic presence, not unlike the source of its population on Kuat. The final political or cultural center, Shawken, was the location of another of the wonders of the galaxy called the Shawken Spire, an ancient space elevator which reached low orbit by the time it was destroyed in the 18,000s BBY, after over 9 millennia of construction, meaning Shawken itself would have been part of at least the earlier waves of sleeper ships coming from Coruscant, if not earlier Rakatan relocations before then. Eventually, it was the location where a mad scientist attempted to create a universe-destroying superweapon called the Shawken device, which was intended to recreate the Big Bang, causing a possibly even bigger reset of canon. The final planet that I'm aware of being explicitly named as a core founder, which isn't present in the Essential Atlas, is called Bezha Two, which we get very few details on, but which gets mentioned as a lost planet in the Old Republic, as in the MMO, not the organization. Despite losing contact with the Old Republic, meaning the organization, not the MMO, the planet remained inhabited and was eventually reconnected, tens of thousands of years later. Most of the information in this video comes from a mix of the Essential Atlas, Coruscant and the Core Worlds, and the Essential Guide to Warfare, Essential Chronology, and some other stuff like Han Solo and the Corporate Sector Sourcebook. But for this planet, I'm entirely relying on Wikipedia, since I have never played the mission this is from in the Old Republic, and the Old Republic as a whole remains one of my biggest gaps in knowledge. But when I've tried to go and look up other stuff for this mission, I can't find anything. I'm not even 100% sure if it's available content anymore. I do want to play more of the Old Republic this year to kind of fill in some gaps I have, but just keep that in mind. I may be entirely wrong about how this planet worked. But on top of that, while these are the explicit core founders, other planets were very likely part of the Republic, like in the situations we've already covered with smaller star empires, but there were some other known inhabited planets at the time which may or may not have joined this early. Caecilius was another powerful core world which had several planets, including the later shipyard world of Forost, under its control, but which may not have joined the Republic until a bit later. So it could have been a core founder along with Forost, but it also may not have been. There are other examples of planets that we know were colonized this early, but where we don't have information on when exactly they joined the Republic, like Corellia. On the other hand, there are planets which we pretty explicitly know did not join the Republic this early. Metellos was a close neighbor of Coruscant, residing in the same sector, and it even held a comparably large population for much of history, dating back far before the Republic's founding, so there was actually a lot of contact between Coruscant and Metellos. But because it lacked the advantage of Coruscant's exact positions on the major hyperlanes, it was rarely necessary for other worlds to directly interact with it. Metellos hoped expanding the other direction away from the Republic would give them their own major new trade routes, and then they might be able to build their own coalition like the Republic but slightly to the left on a map. Ultimately, they just butted up against the unknown regions, and that meant the trade route they were able to build was quite small, blocking their progress. Within a few centuries, Metellos had to come crawling to the Senate and ask to join, rather than get the original status as a core founder. Another example we might have is Raltir, which did join fairly early, but it may or may not have been an original core founder, and I think the information we have points to it not being one. Raltir's relationship with the Republic would have been complicated by its location in the Darpa sector with Acelles. Raltir was very proud to have not been a member of the Acelles Empire. So, since there's no explicit mentions of Raltir joining at the start of the Republic, it's possible that this rivalry with Acelles put them off until later. When it did finally join, Raltir became a major financial center for the galaxy. That's going to do it for our look at the core founders, though. This video was actually a request from the community, and I have a Discord channel full of some other lore video requests I'll be trying to dig through in the near future. So let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see covered as well. Thank you for watching, and remember to like and subscribe for more. It really helps the channel grow.